I've heard all my life that America is a Christian nation. Is it?
You know, I get asked by journalists and students quite often whether the United States is a Christian country. And the simple answer to that is that no, we're not a Christian country, but we are a country full of Christians.
We are culturally a Christian nation, or at least a culturally Protestant nation. But in terms of the law, we are not a Christian nation, nor are we a Muslim nation or a Jewish nation. We are a secular country.
And perhaps, all that means to some people is, well, Christianity is the majority religion. A lot of our cultural traditions, the traditions of our society and of our government, we're associated with this specific religion, and so that's what makes sense.
And I think that in many people's minds, the confusion comes from two things. One, the Constitution quite clearly states that government cannot make any laws respecting an establishment of religion. So the United States cannot declare itself any certain religion.
And what we mean by that is that when our Constitution was being drafted, the founders were heavily influenced by the Enlightenment philosophy, particularly of John Stuart Mill and John Locke. And their beliefs, the beliefs that grew out of that intellectual ferment that we call the Enlightenment, led to a belief in the separation of church and state. Now, students will sometimes also say, well, I don't see the terminology separation of church and state. It's not in our Constitution that way. But the First Amendment really cannot be read in any other way.
But 56% of Americans, according to a survey in 2008, think the Constitution does do precisely that it does declare Christianity as the official religion. So I think that some of the confusion comes from people simply not knowing what the Constitution says. The second, I think, confusion comes from the fact that people confuse the planters with the founders. The planters were people who came over as colonists, many of whom were looking for religious freedom, and they founded religious institutions here that were very closely tied to the state.
And so, of course, you have the group, the Puritans, who, really saw God starting a covenant with them in the New World. This country was going to be imbued with God's permissions, with God's protection, and so on. And so the success of the country would rise and fall, upon their obedience to what they saw God calling them to do. And so early on in our history, we had this, conflation of the United States being this nation that's perhaps a nation of God.
But of course, we're talking about the early 1600s. Compare that to the founders in the late 1700s, and they were doing something quite different. And the Constitution clearly states that the country is not going to have any official religion at all.
What we have is two religion clauses. We have the Anti-Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause. And taken together, those two clauses are a prescription for government neutrality on all matters of religious belief, and most, but not all, matters of religious observance.
So then you move into the 19th century, and the United States became a place where a lot of new faiths, a lot of new sects, and various denominations grew out of the original immigrants that came here. And it's this marketplace of various religious faiths that a lot of scholars say have led to the highly religious nature of the United States today. You compare that to a place, say, in Scandinavia or in the United Kingdom, where you have a state church, and without that extra competition, where people can go and find the flavor of religion that really appeals to them, it seems that people have become less religious there, whereas we become more religious here. So that's part of the answer of why the United States has become such a religious nation.
By removing government from the equation, we created this very robust marketplace, not just the marketplace of ideas that we have under the free speech provisions of the First Amendment, but this marketplace of religions, all competing for people's beliefs. And we ended up with a much more robust religious approach in America. It has become an interesting observation when people come to the United States that we are so much more religious as a people than most other Western democratic countries, and that is really a result of government not messing around with our souls.